Since the middle of the 12th century, Finland has been the cockpit of Northern Europe. She's had her toes chewed by the Germans. She's been swallowed by Sweden. She's been eviscerated by the Russians under both the Tsars and the Soviets. You wonder why she's watchful. Today, I think a better hour may have struck. Within the last 2 or 3 days, the European Commission has agreed, I believe, Mr. Ambassador, to admit Finland to the European community. And if anybody knows what that means, is our speaker tonight, and let me tell you why. He has been a career diplomat. He joined the Foreign Service in 1966 after studying and getting his master's and his doctorate at the University of Helsinki. He had a time at Harvard, which may or may not have queered the whole thing, held a number of large and important offices in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, and became ambassador to the United States in November of 1988. He is Jukka Robert Valtasaari. Delighted to have you in Baltimore, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you for a very nice introduction. It's true that over the 800 years or so we had to sort of make a number of choices, and then other people made choices for us. It led us to be careful, fairly silent, pretty straightforward, and waiting for a while before to give an answer. I try not to follow that tradition when the question and answer period comes, but where I come from, in eastern Finland, where I was born, people are extremely careful about the giving a quick and a direct answer to any question whatsoever. They are living at the eastern border, so there must be a reason for it. There's one of these sort of standard stories of this is that there was a street sign saying 8 miles. And then a foreigner came and asked that 8 miles to where? And the answer was, where are you going? So much for the cats and dogs. You know, there are ways of covering oneself. I'm very happy and indeed honored to have been invited to speak for this large and knowledgeable audience. You know that in the ambassadors we have only one rule: to not enter into hypothetical thinking, speaking, or answering. In today's world, it's very difficult because whatever you do, where you have to make your plan 2 or 3 years ahead, is very hypothetical indeed. So I think that I can take my little liberties and be somewhat hypothetical, assume a number of things about the future in Europe, and then you will see in about 2 years' time whether I was right or not. I wasn't. Nobody else is either. Everybody's knowledge is pretty much as good these days. We have, however, professional people in the area, those who practice foreign policy. I mean, they like to think that experience counts, and that's the only thing one can base one's opinions on, really. Before talking about Finland, really, today's policies and the choices and so on, I'd like to refer to the history a bit, and not just a little bit. I mean, I don't want to bore you at all, but the true story is that if you are going to analyze Finland and try to do it without a geopolitical or historical perspective, you are bound to fail, because the speed that life turns over by next Monday, it isn't like that for us. I begin with a citation that I found the other day, which may sound redundant, but here it is. There was this is the citation the exact citation is, and I read it: first, we have to know that Finland has always been located between East and West at the border of Europe. Now, this is and for us a very redundant thing, but the point is not the content, the point is the time. And this is taken from a letter by the Pope to the Archbishop of Sweden, Uppsala, in 1172. And it's very true today, and it contains the fundamental wisdom. Why it was 1172? The reason was that Christendom at the time was divided into two, the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox, and the dividing line happened to cross Finland, and a lot of things followed from that. We have been building castles in the eastern border and the western border and the southern border. Those who have visited castle building comes from fear, and fear comes from uncertainty. Many of those, the building really started in the 13th century, 14th, 15th, and so on. So since then, we have been obviously, little do I know, but I think we have been pondering about different alternatives involving military means, forceful means of defending one's independence. I think it's a sign of times that the most, perhaps the second most beautiful of those castles, the one that is in the eastern border, is now hosts the best known musical event in Finland, the Savonlinna Opera Festival. If you happen to go there, take this as your program, and you see the history and the contemporary music at the same time. Now, a few more historical notes. Early last century, we were, as was said already, we were sort of detached from Sweden, given to the Russian Empire as a result of a deal by Napoleon and the Alexander I. We were not heard until it, of course, we became an autonomous Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire as a result of a deal made by others that had to do with the great power politics in Europe at that time. And early this century, the then great upheaval in the then Russia, which became Soviet Union, the Great Revolution, took place in 1917. In the context of that, we became independent. And in the context of the Second World War, again, the other people fought one war and we fought three for some reasons that are perhaps not to be repeated here, but two against Russia and one against Germany. So there was an even-handedness in the events of history here. But as a result of that war, we lost all the three in the first place. But what we think that we won the peace in the sense that we, during the years since, have been able to develop into a Scandinavian pluralistic democracy with respect of the Scandinavian or American, for that matter, values of equality, freedom, and justice. We have developed a policy of neutrality which served us very well until quite well. It still serves us well, but it will have to be rethought in these days as everything. And we have developed a diversified economy, a GNP per capita, which is about the level of the United States. It used to be higher, but now the dollar is higher, so it may be lower again, but pretty much at the level of the United States and Germany. Now, this all was achieved in a divided Europe, a Cold War Europe. And when I say that this was that we knew how to manage our affairs in the Cold War, be that as far from me as possible to express any nostalgia whatsoever in toward those times. I remember Larry Egerberger said pretty much the same thing, that there was some stability in those times, and he was immediately criticized as the old Cold Warrior, nostalgic about the old times. Not at all. It's good that the Cold War went away, and it is a pity that it was not followed by a time of an automatic march towards freedom, democracy, market forces, and so on all over the world. That march will be a long march, but the direction has been chosen. What I'm about to say now, when I go to the Finnish, this was a sort of a long introduction to what I'm going to say about Finland, the departing point is that, you know, the good old truths that were valid during the 40 years are no more valid for us than anybody else in Europe. Now, what happened? Within 3 years, tomorrow, 3 years ago, the Berlin Wall fell. Communism has lost its appeal. The Soviet Union, subsequently 2 years later, divided itself into 12 constituent, into a loose Commonwealth of independent states, with 12 essentially independent constituent parts, plus the 3 Baltic states. Germany was unified, and so on, and this all happened in 3 years. I'd like to say that no matter which way you look at this process, in hindsight, you come back to the United States' role in this process. It was absolutely instrumental. If you take the unification of Germany, every single initiative came from this country. You could say that it couldn't come from elsewhere either, because Germany was such a difficult question, but the fact of the matter remains that it came from this country. I would, however, like to say that, in particular, having followed the election process and the non-existence, if you wish, of foreign policy in that entire process, I failed to detect the word Russia once. I may have missed something. I hope I have missed something. But anyway, every political collapse of that size and magnitude is a part of a longer process. Nothing happens overnight, really. And this process, the point of the whole thing is to analyze how this process is really going on. And it is not sufficient for anybody, and I'm talking about, again, beyond the normal ambassadorial brief, if you wish. It's not sufficient even for the United States to say that this was done, we won the war, our objectives were completed, as they were in terms of the 40s objectives. Let's now sit back and relax and concentrate on our own affairs and domestic matters. Life is not like that, and I referred to the election process. The election process is a different thing, and then the post-election life is a different thing. There will be a new agenda, and where there are different issues and different problems, but the problems really are in abundance, as you can look from, you know, whichever way you look at the word. Again, don't want to say that I'm nostalgic about the old times, but the problems are different and perhaps more difficult to deal with. In terms, I'm talking about ethnic problems in particular. Who has the wisdom in Yugoslavia, for instance? I mean, it's even intellectually hard to think that one could have that wisdom sufficient to not only to solve it in paper, but to make somebody else believe in the area that you might have a point. Now, in this new agenda, I'd like to offer you a Finnish perspective, what, from our point of view, happens. And if I were to speak here 10 years ago, our agenda and the United States agenda would have been totally different, really. Today, it's not that different at all. If you look at on our agenda, the future of Russia is perhaps security policy-wise number 1. The integration is Europe is number 2. The future of the Baltic states is an absolutely, that's sort of an immediate concern, Estonia being our kin nation speaking similar language and so on. The only country who speaks the similar language. We only have one cousin in that sense, so you feel more probably than you would perhaps otherwise. There is a totally different foreign policy environment, and let me go somewhat into what is different. Now, the first thing is, of course, security. For any nation, national security comes first. And then the second question is, what does national security consists of in the post-war, Cold War time? it's not entirely a military concept. It's much more a cooperation-oriented concept these days. But let me just say a few things from a Finnish point of view. The one thing is that Russia re-emerged. You can say that it emerged or it re-emerged. From our point of view, it re-emerged. There was a 70-year interval called Soviet Union in between, in a relationship that really has lasted for not only decades but centuries. But it re-emerged a different Russia. It had lost its allied countries in Central Europe. The Baltic states became parts of the former Soviet Union, became independent. There is no buffer zone anymore between in the northern area between really Moscow and the core of the West. This happens for the first time since Peter the Great. Really, there's always been somebody parts of the Soviet Union or Russia in between. That leads us to look at the situation, military, political, security, and economic situation, with the point of view of analyzing it first. Because if your analysis is wrong, your conclusions are wrong. If your analysis is right, that's not a guarantee that your conclusions are right, but at least you have to begin with the analysis. And then you start looking at what really happened in our neighborhood. If I start, I said that the security comes first. What one should look at then is what happened and what did not happen. Now, in Central Europe, the military juxtaposition of the two alliances withered away, was unwound. That's Central Europe, not so in the northern flank. Certainly not so in the southern flank, but the ethnic strife is the southern problem. It's not a northern problem. But the fact remains that within 200 miles of our eastern border, there still remains the same military force that there used to be. For what purpose? You can give many reasons, but there it is anyway, without speculating on the purpose. And that military force is about the size of about 300,000 people, 11 divisions. It's getting more modern now because what is moved from Central Europe is moving someplace. And the Kola Peninsula military infrastructure is a very strong one. So suppose you have, say, 500 very modern tankers, you don't know where to service them. You bring them up to the Kola Peninsula. That's I'm guessing here, but that makes sense. Suppose you have a lot of barracks that are not necessarily absolutely full, and you don't have housing for the people who are moving from Central Europe. Where do you bring them? You bring them where you have housing. So the size of the force is the same, and the military potential has increased. Now, are we threatened, is the next question. No, we are not threatened about that force. It was never against us, really. It had many functions. One was the defense of St. Petersburg in general. Everybody defends the big cities. One was the strategic naval base in Murmansk. The third was the nuclear forces, the SS-18 silos in Arkangel. And the support functions, naval and otherwise, in that area, they are there. And the question is that what shall we do about it? We can't do anything about it. Can we ignore it? Not completely. Can we think that let's concentrate on other things than worrying about the military potential? Yes, we concentrate on other things. We think that the future is in a cooperation. Then comes next question is the size. Finland is 5 million, St. Petersburg is 5 million, and Russia is 170 million, and the old Soviet Union was 280. Can we fix them? No, is the question. But what can we fix? We have to concentrate on something. It's everybody's responsibility to try to bring substance to the notion that these new countries should be brought closer to Western institutions, Western living standard, Western industrial standard, market economy, and so on. It doesn't happen automatically. Market economy is not something that lurks behind a corner and like a dog let free, and there it is. Certainly not in Russia, where they have no historical experience of that particular way of running one's economy at all. So what do? We have for some years had a policy, what we call the policy toward the adjacent areas in Russia, or the neighbor areas in Russia, where we have 4 years, I mean, prior to the downfall of Yeltsin, 2 years into perestroika period. Gorbachev.
Did you mean Yeltsin?
Sorry, this I hope is not anywhere in a tape or TV. What I was saying is that when the Russian process started with Gorbachev, you saw what was coming, and then the rest is just power succession. And 2 years into perestroika, we started figuring out, will that really offer some alternatives? We started identifying together then, and we continue doing it together. What would be the problems? Where could one help? What should be the first priorities? Where could the market forces really come into play? What the priorities should be, and so on. And this work has been going on for 3-4 years now, and the real life answers is of course in the economic cooperation. The general answers are, let's help them to develop parliamentary mechanisms and so on, but we are really not perhaps in the position of teach parliamentary mechanism in a very efficient way. You need to be a bit bigger for that. But we think that we can be efficient in the economic area of economic cooperation. The first thing is to define common interests. The most obvious of common interest is that Finland receives about half of its pollution from the east. Therefore, the best investment, 25% of the west from the west or south, and rest is our own doing. Our best investment in our environment is in the east of our border. We have therefore developed schemes, protocols, letter of intents, whatever, in 3 areas essentially. One is to cleaning up the nickel industry in the Kola Peninsula, which is a really bad polluter. The second is a lot of environmental projects in an urban situation of St. Petersburg. And the third, water, sewage, water cleaning. 80% of the water in St. Petersburg just goes through. So there is a lot to do there, and this is not painting a bad picture. It is a consequence of a big, large country which did not pay attention to environment, and we have all been guilty for that 20 or 30 years ago. But they are just late compared to the others. The most obvious of all, of course, which really has received international attention, is nuclear energy and the safety of nuclear energy. There are 15 reactors of you call it the graphite core reactors, the Chernobyl type reactors, if you want to scare people. That's the other way of saying it. But there are 15 of those that everybody agrees needs to be replaced. And the replacing cost of 15 of those is about $20 billion, no more than that. The 2 of them are within 3 hours of wind from the southern coast of Finland, the Sosnovyj Bor. One of those malfunctioned already last spring. There are 2 of them in Lithuania. 2 of them malfunctioned in the last 6 months. And political analysts, I'm not a political analyst anymore, but I would still suggest that if your 2 nuclear reactors malfunctions and you don't have sufficient electricity and the schoolroom temperature is 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and your Communist Party won the election, so that these things might have something to do. There might be something here. If nothing functions, you go back to the old times. That's absolutely a necessity, not only for the energy production or electricity production of those areas. It is an essential matter for the neighbors, of being able to be sure that these reactors that have no containment core whatsoever are replaced by something else. And I'm told by the American experts of nuclear electricity that if one bad malfunctioning more would discontinue the nuclear industry of the world, because it would be so difficult to make those economic decisions. I'm relating to somebody else's knowledge, but the fact remains that this is an important matter. Now, this is the way we look at the Soviet Union, and the problem basically is that they replaced old decision-making, straightforward military-type decision-making with nothing. And the rest has been a sequence of changes, and people have their old reflexes of expecting orders from someplace and they don't come. Therefore, it's difficult, just difficult to make decisions, get the protocols, get plans to stick, and so on. The will is there and the resources are there. It's just what we think is going to be a transitional period, but it requires patience way beyond the quarterly economic reporting the CEOs in this country will have to do. So you really have to have a long-term perspective, and we just wish that the more there are those companies, the better. In the Baltic countries, the problem is easier in the sense that they are very small economies. 1.5 million people in Estonia, 2.5 in Latvia. They will have to restart again, but for instance, the Estonian-Finnish relationship is such that they have Estonians have seen the Finnish TV since there was TV in Finland, since '57 really. As a result, they speak better Finnish than the Finns do because they speak the TV Finnish, which needs to be an absolutely correct language. Therefore, in the Estonian relationship, I think myself that much is done already by opening the borders and letting things happen, so to say. I heard, to my astonishment even, I would say, that the predictions of the ferryboat companies when they make investments is that in a few years' time there will be 1 million passengers between Estonia and Finland. They have 1.5 million people. That's 40 miles away. So, I mean, if that happens, then a lot has happened already without any particular planning or contingency planning or whatnot. Now, this is the way it looks from the Scandinavian perspective, and my point really is that Scandinavia is not a northern corner of Europe tucked in some place up there. It is a vital and a part of the European equation and must be analyzed as such. I would say a few things about the other part, which is the Western or the Central European developments, really, because not everything is Finnish, Russian in world. We love to think. It's always easy to think bilaterally, but a lot of European institutions, NATO, WEU, CSCE, all these security-related collective institutions had to change their approach, their role, their membership, whatnot. NATO not yet the membership, but NATO created the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, an adjacent organization involving all the former enemies. So in the NATO context, the former enemies now discuss common questions, while the NATO work proper is going on. Now, we would like to see that when you take the picture of Europe in its entirety, what we'd like to see if we were asked is that there would be far better rules for European peacekeeping by Europeans. By whom those rules? Probably by the CSCE, the Helsinki process, which includes all involved. By whom? Probably with NATO forces, for instance, provided the rules have first been agreed in the larger sphere, because otherwise it would be NATO forces against somebody else, and that would not be very, very constructive. United Nations, yes, of course, but United Nations collective security mechanism is an important one, but I happen to think that the regional approach might be a more efficient one, provided we get these institutions in shape. And I think that the Yugoslavian events are, if they are anything, they are proof of the fact that events here lead and the institutions try to follow one way or the other. The Western European political decision-making is really very reactionary, but they managed to react somehow, not very successfully in Yugoslavia, but they still go forward. It would have been nice if this had happened the other way around, that we would have a European mechanism that would be really efficient. But I say this would be nice. I don't. Yugoslavia is a case per se. The second process is the economic one, the integration. You mentioned here that Finland has been accepted to the EC. Not quite. We will start the negotiation. The EC statement on the negotiations came out 2 days ago. That's for us a most important matter. Why is it? Because of our trade, 2/3 goes to the Western Europe in the first place. So in that sense, we are in Europe. And when the Maastricht came, Maastricht being the Maastricht agreements on anything that starts from economy going to common defense, when those decisions on that agreement was created, we took a hard look on our own ways of promoting our own interest and concluded that this would rather happen from within the EC rather than without. So you might question, what's the problem? 2/3 the trade goes there anyway. The problem was that we, like Sweden and Austria, were neutral countries, and how do you join a common defense if you are a neutral country? The definition of neutrality is that you don't do this particular thing. There was quite a bit of soul searching, and if I again read, if I can find it, what is the EC definition of what we are joining, as given to us now, 1 year after or 10 months after we filed our application. Or before that, I say that we looked very hard into Maastricht agreements and figured out maybe a good portion of it, but not all of it. And our statement was, we can take the agreement as agreed in Maastricht, thereby leaving the content of the agreement to those who agreed. Now, the avis, that avis is the statement of the EC Commission, states to us the following, which is a precondition of the acceptance of the beginning of the negotiations. They say that the Finnish accession is going to be to a European Union characterized by the establishment of economic and monetary union, ultimately including a single currency, the implementation of a foreign and security policy, including the eventual framing of a defense policy, which might in time lead to a common defense. So that's, I think it's a wonderful bureaucratic way of saying that let's, here are objectives and let us start, but no matter what, this required from Finland and from Sweden a fundamental soul searching. What is neutrality in these new circumstances? And Sweden and Finland came from a substantial point of view exactly to the same conclusion. Let's reduce it to the core of it. Much of our policy was to avoid East-West, getting involved into East-West confrontations and minding our own business when big powers had quarrels. That's not relevant because anymore because this juxtaposition has gone away. So what is the core? And the core is for us and Sweden, as they put it, is number 1, indigenous defense, and number 2, military non-alliance. So NATO membership for us is not the current proposition, but otherwise we think that the new neutrality requires from us rather to participate in peacekeeping, conflict resolution efforts in Europe. There's no moral or political or self-interested reason to stay aside of that, to stay outside this process. But the real answer really is that or should I put the other way, in these pre-negotiations with the EC, we were often asked, what is a neutral country's solidarity to the common defense? And we would say, as good boys would, as agreed in Maastricht. We'll take what you take, we won't take more than you take, and no less. But the real point is, of course, the other way. I mean, had we not been good boys, had we been Harvard professors or somebody more sort of intellectual about this, we would say that what would be your solidarity about your border, which is also our border in the east, where the stability is not the likelihood, the income differences on both sides of the border are biggest of any border in Europe, really. And here I would get back to history, and our historical lesson has been that you really, in the end up defending yourself, no matter what the collective systems are. You remember Finland and the League of Nations, you know, what happened then. We brought our case to the League of Nations and did it courageously, and that was it. Nothing particular. We got a statement and nothing happens. So in the end, without being trying to be a doomsayer, in the end there will always be a Finnish responsibility for the Finnish borders, and that's as really, I think, as simple as that. The question, therefore, is that we will have to allot a certain portion of our GNP in the defense area. There's no immediate peace dividend for us to be gathered, but so be it. Our share is still much less than yours. But when you look at decisions such as the purchase of American F-18 fighters that was concluded last summer, it is a reflection of not that we purchased from America, we just bought the best fighter that was available, but that we cannot draw any military conclusions from the situation that would indicate that peace came. We just have to play it safe. This all brings me back to the end of the 30 minutes in the first place, but you know, in the end of the beginning of the story, I would say, and that is that the geopolitics from a Finnish perspective look pretty much the same in the short run compared to what they looked 2 years ago. There was a saying of one of our great presidents, President Paasikivi, who was the first post-war president, who used to say that the Finnish triangle of fate is St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Berlin. And he said this when St. Petersburg was Leningrad and Berlin was in Bonn, so to say. That may be the future fate of the Finnish triangle, but that being aside, the difference of the old days and the new days is that the information age, which has, in my opinion, brought down the old Soviet system, all relations, irrespective of geographical distances and geographical contributions, becomes internationalized one way or the other, and that therefore all commitments, smaller or bigger commitments that are made, will be carefully scrutinized by international community. And therefore designing a foreign policy for a small country or a big country requires increasing care, if you wish. And I'm only talking about designing, not even the implementation of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very thoughtful and thoroughly interesting presentation. The floor is now open for questions until 10 minutes after 7. Yes, sir.
2 brief questions, Ambassador. First is, you're the only ambassador of a country whose name became the word for a process, Finlandization. Do you think that was a fair term? And my second question is, do you favor NATO membership for Finland?
The question is an interesting historical and theoretical question, and that is Finlandization has come to represent a particular process and for many states a kind of a danger in Cold War terms. Would you comment about the word Finlandization, the concept, and how valid you think it is? And your second part of the question was?
Do you today favor membership in NATO
And-
for Finland?
And do you want membership in NATO?
Finlandization is also, like any political concept, is a function of time. You know, the Finlandization that you probably mean here, it was the Finlandization of let's say, until about 5 years ago, for the 1940s, essentially implying that Finland has to give away a lot of its own decision-making power in order to please Russia, in order to do this, in order to do that. Our answer was, we had various reactions. So President Kekkonen used to say when he tried, you know, he quickly realized it was a mistake, but he anyway tried to say that if Finlandization means that you can get along with your neighbors and still doing whatever you be able to do, whatever you want to do, then let's all get Finlandized. And what was left in the press, let's all get Finlandized. So he quickly stopped in explaining. There was another type of Finlandization when the perestroika and when started and when the Russian withdrawal from Central Europe started, which was, would Finland's fate really be a good fate for Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia? Let them get Finlandized. And they said, Estonians, Lithuanians included, no way would we accept such limitations by Soviet Moscow, and so on and so on. So this was, we never felt that we were curtailed in any particular way, and the last difficult times politically really were in early 1960s in the difficult, but you know, which needed particular handling in the context of the Berlin crisis. But now, in the present situation, it's very hard for anybody to figure out what Finland could stand for others. So I think that the term is pretty much gone. It's all a function of historical developments. The question of NATO, no. Our political position is that NATO is not a current proposal. We are not closing any doors, because if we were, we couldn't figure out what doors to close. The concept of you know, the term European security architecture that came about in Europe. That architecture for me suggests that everything is in place and there are walls and doors either open or closed. We like to speak about landscape architecture, because anything very rigid right now is not a good proposition. But our president met Manfred Werner 2 weeks ago for the first time. They discussed this issue, and the conclusion is, let's put this part aside now and concentrate on the EC, and who knows what happens in the future.
Would you summarize economic conditions in Finland?
I would summarize them in that by saying that we have the difficulty of managing happiness. We had 13 consecutive years of growth averaging 4.5%. That is 1.5 times the performance of this country. And at the same time, 5.8 or 7% was it increased in industrial productivity over that same period, which is again 1.5 times your number. And then it ended, as they say. And why it ended, you have to imagine a Texas. When oil prices go down 25%, our paper prices, 40% of our exports went down internationally, 25%, and then the Mexican trade falls off at once, which happened in our Soviet trade. They went from barter system to convertible currencies, and they didn't have any. And we told them, I happen to have the position of Director General for Trade Policy before. They looked at the barter systems and wanted to outlaw them, and without the economic realities really in mind. And our trade was 15% it's now 2.8% of our exports. Exports being 25%, so we lost about 3% of our GNP at once. So if I'm to summarize last year's situation, I would say free fall, -6% of the GNP at once, and no bottom in sight this time in last year. Now the bottom is in sight. There are a lot of measures have been taken, including cutting the budgets, going to the entitlements, in Western terms, brave measures that some other countries have backed away from. Right now, well, I don't criticize other countries. I say that we had to do because money ran out, and that you do things when money runs out. Right now, exports are growing at the level about 10%. We will have the biggest current account surplus in years that I remember, since the 60s at least. The bank crisis resembles your savings and loans, so that the asset side is revalued totally, and the banks are in a fundamental difficulty. But that is, and you don't see quite yet where that goes, but that will have to be handled, because it's not savings and loans; it's the main commercial banks who also perform the role of the savings and loans. So if I were to predict a -1%, that is down from 6 last year, 1 this year, and about 2.5% growth next year, you'll see in the year after whether I was right. So there was Finns tend to think positively. You never know where the 8 miles are to, but I mentioned. But if there is something positive in a free fall, it is that if you manage to reach the bottom very quickly and come up, then your equipment is not old, and your people are still well educated, and that's the best resources that Finland has, is the people.
Would you quantify the point you raised earlier of the nuclear pollution and what steps you might be taking about it, Russian pollution especially?
The nuclear pollution is really negligent. What has happened, there were 2 instances. One was Chernobyl, and there we were plain lucky, because your pollution does not depend on your measure, it depends on the direction of the wind. And the wind went to a different direction and only reached Finland 4 days after the explosion. So we were lucky then. The quantification is I should remember, because one of my jobs then was to sort of speak for the press on Chernobyl. But this nanocuries and other measurements, they are very difficult. But we used to say then that if I eat 4,000 crayfishes a year, or 2.5 tons of reindeer meat a year, then I would reach the level. So that we were lucky, other countries were not as lucky. The second one, the Sosnovyy Bor, was they managed to close it very quickly. So, what came out is really negligible, and we know because we were the ones who measured it. What are we going to do about it? There is an intention, a protocol even in that phase by a company that I can't name now, a Finnish subsidiary or American subsidiary of a Finnish company, who has made an offer to replace these 2 Sosnovyy Bor reactors with lignite-fired boilers. With the investment of about $500 million apiece, which is not very much.
More about some of the stories we've heard about the Soviet dumping waste in some of the northern seas, and whether that part of it.
Not in the Baltic seas. No, there is. We don't know that there is really anything there. In the Arctic seas, I just don't know what it is. Of course, that there have been accidents and submarine accidents. These are reported facts in military journals. But I can't, unfortunately, quantify that. But in the Baltic seas, the fact remains that there is a submarine fleet defending St. Petersburg, essentially, which has ports in Latvia and Lithuania. But these are good old propeller-driven, old-fashioned things that age takes them away if it hasn't taken already much of it away. So I can't really give the real answer to your question in the Arctic seas.
Would you comment on the future of the ruble?
Well, the only thing I can say, it's a good question. But perhaps the serious answer is there is within sight. You can postulate it. What all does have to happen in order that to happen, and the thing is really that ruble will have to get, and I hope that I'm not pejorative, but I just say that it will have to get convertible domestically first. It's a ruble. It's a currency that floats really widely domestically. Therefore, it hasn't the value beyond the trading value at a given point of time. If we could do that with rubles, it's fine. If we could do the trade with dollars, it's fine. But the problem is for the trade and developing the trade. The problem is the loans and the loan guarantees, to be particular. In areas such as nuclear cleaning, the money would be around, but you need the Russian, or rather their back guarantees for the Western guarantees. That is what is missing. What happened in the Finnish-Russian trade is that our exports were very investment product oriented. Shipbuilding, ships, machinery, and so on. That is a very sort of sophisticated package of national exports. All that had to do with investment goods fell off, and the rest is 3%. And the rest is traded in dollars and pound sterlings rather than rubles. So that's where it is. If you want to develop the country, you have to solve two things, energy first and the mechanisms, financing mechanisms of investment products.
Do you have a problem with immigration? And would you comment on that, please?
No, we don't now, and I give you. This is a quick answer, and I give you a bit of an explanation to how we view the immigration and how we view the threat. Historically, we've been behind everybody else. So the Western immigration mostly stopped in Copenhagen and Stockholm, and then a few filtered through. We have very little immigration traditionally. I mean, we are far away from the melting pot type of society, and it has had certain advantages and disadvantages, but that's the way it is anyway. The eastern border used to be a very closed border. I mean, it's a closed border, and if I say a very closed border, it means that on the other side, on the eastern side, the eastern border areas were KGB's responsibility. So, I mean, there was a fairly broad area of nothing behind the border. So there wasn't much traffic across the border. I could count, one would know every instance. From the south, Estonia, somewhat more, but they used to go to Sweden because Sweden has a large Estonian community, and it's always easier to emigrate to a community. So we have really very little experience. But we had this idea in mind that what if? It became obvious at the time when the Eastern Germans started marching, voting with their legs, as they say, that immigration and emigration is if not the main problem, it is the fundamental problem that would shake governments. Governments don't die or fall or stumble or whatever with the formulation of the CSCE or a NATO communique, but emigration and immigration is certainly an issue. We then did some planning, and I can't reveal what that planning is, but I can tell you what the conclusion of the planning is, was that what if 5 million people start walking toward Finland where there is 5 million people? The answer is we can't do much about it, nor can we handle the situation. There is a contingency planning of various situations. We then went as far as, not deliberately, but it's a longer story, but there is a tribe outside St. Petersburg called Ingrian tribe, which is a Finnish tribe. It's part of the Karelian population, and they are Finnish speakers. And we welcomed them back. It's about 20,000 people, sort of manageable size. And I believe that 1,000 of them, I saw once a number, it could be a few more, but basically not very many came. Our conclusion is that people don't move en masse if they don't have to. And then you figure out what is the circumstance in which they have to. And then you come to the nuclear reactors, water, sewage systems breaking down, the infrastructural problems, which there are a lot of them in the big cities in Russia. So that's the long answer. The short answer was no.
Would you tell us about your school system?
It's, I was trying to figure out the key numbers of high school students in proportional, but can't do it quite quickly. I'll tell you how the system works. You start, it's a basically public system. Education is a government responsibility. It hasn't anything to do with the quality of the system at all. It is just that you don't pay for your kids' education. I have two in university. One's price tag is 28,200 in this country, and the other one is 0 in Finland. You start your school at the age of 6, 1 year later than here. You will go to your college. Your high school starts at the age of 16. It's a unified school system until then. Compared to the American system, we emphasize languages quite a bit, reading quite a bit. I mean, handling written material, and with some success, judging by the international comparisons, which I just they were in the press here, so I happen to know. An international comparison was taken of 9-year-olds, and we were topping the list, and the United States was second, and the 14-year-olds, we were still topping the list, and the United States was 7th. So we probably do something well in the just prior to the high school. The language education, an average kid, by the time he reaches college, has had education in 2 national languages, Swedish being the other, and 2 other languages, compulsory, and a third option. So either 4 or 5 languages by the time you reach university. We pride ourselves of the quality of our engineers. Engineering is still a very sought-after profession. And I say this as a proud father because my son is a third-year college student. But it is still a sought after. You have to score very well in school in order to get into the 3 universities. We have, in terms of, one example is patents per capita, and we have the highest patent number per capita in the world. So what education produces is a sort of a basic skill, good skills in learning and handling, reading material, engineers, basic skills in languages, and then what it doesn't produce, because I've had one kid in this country, the sort of argumentation, discussion skills are just not around in the Finnish course. You have to struggle, with them all by yourselves later on. Judging by my daughter and son, one went to Finland, and the son developed the skills to my sort of, not an embarrassment, but I would have appreciated somewhat fewer skills of argumentation back home, but at a later age.
Mr. Ambassador, let me thank you very much. For what obviously was a thoroughly enjoyable and informative and much appreciated evening. We're grateful for your coming here.
Thank you so much. Thank you.